BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays this year I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Now, to all of you who followed the Zodiac Killer mystery, there will also be a bonus episode that will be coming out this week, and that will come out tomorrow, and it will be discussing the book Zodiac Letters, Edward Wayne Edwards by Jason Hughes. So I invite you to tune into that, and if you're listening to this in a future date, you can visit the book discussion on Zodiac Letters, Edward Wayne Edwards by Jason Hughes. In this episode, there's going to be a combination of discussions that's going to happen because I'm going to discuss Jack the Ripper as well as the Thames Torso Killer, and I personally believe that all things Jack the Ripper are Thames Torso Killer related. And it goes back to last week's episode where I was doing a direct response to the Debunk Files video on the Forgotten 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, and he was simply talking about the Canonical 5, the murders of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. And I received this response from Dave Smith, which says, some more forgotten victims are Harriet Boswell, who was murdered in December of 1872, silently killed in her hotel room. Her throat was slit possibly 2 times, and this was possibly the first victim of Jack the Ripper. Then there's the Thames Torso victims. They don't have names aside from poor Elizabeth Jackson. She died within a year of Annie Chapman. Not lost her life, but also that of her growing baby. Her mom had to be the one to identify her remains. And this comment here, again from last week's Ripper Wednesday, reminded me of something that I have been meaning to do for a while, and I really wanted to do a standalone episode on the murder of Elizabeth Jackson, which I will do in the future. But this episode also got me thinking about the Thames Torso Killer because, I'm not going to lie to you guys, I attempted to do one episode in the past, which was a live stream for the old True Crime Talk Radio in the Morning segment, but when I did that, I simply did not have a lot to say about the Thames Torso Killer. I found this to be a very, very confusing true crime case, a very, very confusing true crime mystery, but I wanted to keep exploring this because even though this is something that's going to be a little bit more complex than the traditional true crime case, we certainly don't give up. And to provide us an introduction, we're going to go over to Amazon.com actually and look at the book, The Thames Torso Murders of Victorian England. And this is one that is going to give us our intro for today. The Thames Torso murders have been overshadowed by Jack the Ripper and his crimes, but just as brutal and gruesome, they began in 1887 in London's East End, just north of the Thames River in Rainham, England. The killer took one victim that year, another one in 1888, and 2 more in 1889. He resumed his crimes in 1902, taking his last victim south of the Thames, leaving her body in a pile of dismembered parts as he had done with most of the other victims. This work delves deep into the case of the Thames Torso murders, and it begins with a look at London in the late 1800s, a time of great confusion and tremendous population increase, and the killer's path to London, which seems to include a Paris murder in 1886. Now, I want to be clear, that is a theoretical statement on the part of the writer. Most people believe that the Thames Torso Killer began operating in 1887 in England. The book then examines in great detail each murder and investigation that may have hindered the search for Jack the Ripper. It also raises the idea that Jack the Ripper and the Thames Torso Killer may have been the same man, Severin Klosowski, better known as George Chapman, the Borough Poisoner. It ends with an examination of serial killers, the Ripper, the Torso, and the Borough Poisoner murderer. These cases and the search for clues to the serial killer responsible for the 5 Thames Torso victims and Wolf Levoshin, a dark horse who seems to have known much about all 3 sets of murders, testified at the Chapman murder trial and then faded away as Chapman was sent to the gallows. And one more time, that was from the book The Thames Torso Murders of Victorian London by R. Michael Gordon. And there was another book that explores this, and it's called Arm of Eve by Sarah Bax Horton, and she's the individual who brought Chaim Hyams forward as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and she did a lot of investigative work trying to identify Chaim Hyams, and the full title of her book is Arm of Eve, Investigating the Thames Torso Murders, and her introduction is, Jack the Ripper is often called the world's most notorious unidentified killer, but he was not the first modern serial killer of the streets of London. Before him was another murderer who hunted from the River Thames, one arguably more sadistic and mercurial. The Thames Torso Killer has always lurked in the Ripper's shadows, despite the fact that he murdered and dismembered at least 4 people over 2 years. He started to kill in 1887, over a year before Jack the Ripper, and his last murder was in 1889, almost 10 months after the death of Mary Jane Kelly, the Ripper's last victim. In the book, Arm of Eve, Sarah Bax Horton conducts her own investigation and uses modern criminological profiling to come up with her own suspect. And this would be a book that I definitely have to explore in the future. One more time, Arm of Eve by Sarah Bax Horton. And I've praised her on the channel before. I've said that she does a lot of investigative work that I think is very admirable, even though I might not agree with all of her conclusions. But I think that we're going to have a lot of challenges with this case because it's one where we do not have a lot of evidence that is sent in by the killer. A big difference between the Thames Torso Killer and Jack the Ripper is that Jack the Ripper has this persona that was created and attributed to the serial killer, and I think 100%, absolutely, the reason why people are more familiar with Jack the Ripper than they are with the Thames Torso Killer is because of the letters, because of the name, because people know Jack the Ripper. They know about the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard and the From Hell letter, but they might not be familiar with the activities of the Thames Torso Killer. And one of the things that I find is also very frustrating as somebody who runs a true crime channel is that people are thinking that Jack the Ripper is the first modern serial killer. Even if we're going to go 1 year earlier, you just heard that from the introduction, that maybe the Thames Torso Killer is the first modern serial killer. No, serial killers have existed since the dawn of the cavemen. Serial killers have existed for hundreds of years prior to this. I mean, even if we're going to go back to the 1800s, we have somebody like Thug Bahram in India, perhaps murdering 931 people. I mean, there are so many serial killers who have operated in the world. So I think that it's just, when you say modern serial killer, that's almost an irrelevant term to me, and I don't think it has a lot of value. But I also want to point out that one of the reasons why I wanted to make an episode on the murder of Elizabeth Jackson, which should come out in the future, is because she's the only identified victim of the Thames Torso Killer, who may have also been murdered by Jack the Ripper if these two killers are one and the same. To be clear, Jack the Ripper disemboweled the victims. The Thames Torso Killer dismembered the victims. And last week on Ripper Wednesday, I was discussing that video from the debunk file called The Forgotten Five, which was talking about how the female victims in the Jack the Ripper case had somehow been forgotten and been overshadowed by the killer. And I don't even think that that's true. I mean, I think that the female victims, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Strike, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly, are discussed rather frequently in Ripper circles. But I also wanted to pay attention to the victims of the Thames Torso murders because, much as Dave Smith said in the comment, only Elizabeth Jackson has been identified, and I would actually like to provide the most basic introduction to this story by stating that this is just what's written out. The Canonical 4. This series includes 4 incidents which were filed as belonging to the same series. These cases were the Raynham Mystery, the Whitehall Mystery, the murder of Elizabeth Jackson, and the Pinchin Street torso. And I don't know what you guys think, but as somebody who follows the Jack the Ripper case, I found that the Pinchin Street torso murder gets discussed even more frequently than the murder of Elizabeth Jackson. But that's just my take on the subject. And the Raynham mystery is, between May and June of 1887, the remains of a woman's body were found at the River Thames near Raynham. Workers first encountered a bundle with a female torso. Throughout May and June, various parts of the same body were found, and with the exception of the head and the upper chest. The investigation concluded that the body had not been dissected for medical purpose, but that a degree of medical knowledge had been necessary to perform the dissection. Because doctors could not state the cause of death, she was just stated as found dead. Okay, this is the victim from the Raynham torso, and I think this is a little bit different than Jack the Ripper, because Jack the Ripper's crimes ultimately did not require an enormous amount of medical knowledge. Even if somebody is stating that Jack the Ripper had to have been a doctor, I think that is most likely untrue. And, I mean, again, you're dealing with dismembering the corpses versus disemboweling the women. And with Jack the Ripper, he might have simply been in a rage and not even known what he was doing, pulling out organs and so on. And ultimately, that's where I stand on that. I'm seeing a few differences here. But then we have the Whitehall mystery. Between September 11th and October 17th of 1888, the dismembered remains of a woman were discovered at 3 different sites in the center of the city, including the future site of Scotland Yard's police headquarters. The torso was matched by police surgeon Thomas Bond to a right arm and shoulder that had been previously discovered on the muddy shore of the River Thames in Pimlico on September 11th. The newspaper had initially suspected that the arm was placed in the water as a medical student's prank. On October 17th of 1888, the reporter Jasper Waring used a Spitzbergen dog with the permission of the police and the help of a laborer to find the left leg, cut above the knee, and was buried near the construction site. And this is one of the reasons why I thought, absolutely, you're dealing with 2 different killers. Jack the Ripper didn't cut off the legs of the victims, and I know we're going to find some similarities. Yes, the victims are female. Yes, the victims are cut apart, but Jack the Ripper did not cut off the legs of the victims. And this is something that I just thought about when I was looking at this case for the very first time. But we do have to remember that just because crimes are committed in different ways, it doesn't mean that there is necessarily a different killer. And, I mean, was this all the same person, Severin Klasowski, the borough poisoner? Did he disembowel some women? Did he dismember some women? Did he poison some women? I mean, things like that are possible. I do admit that from a criminological perspective, things like that are possible, but there's an even more widely discussed Jack the Ripper suspect in recent years named Charles Lechmere, who has been brought up in these discussions as well, and he is also someone who has been accused of the Jack the Ripper murders and the Thames Torso murders. So a lot of people believe that this is the same person and the same serial killer, and I am approaching that with an open mind. And if you'd like to read more about Jack the Ripper and the Thames Torso Killer being the same person, I would direct you to the book Cutting Point by Christopher Holmgren, which I do have a response to on this channel, and you can find that under the title Jack the Ripper, Suspect Charles Lechmere, Extended Edition. Now, we're getting to the murder of Elizabeth Jackson, the only identified victim of the Thames Torso Killer. And again, I'm going to have to do a full standalone episode on her in the future. And this states, Elizabeth Jackson was a woman who was found on June 4th of 1889. A female torso was found in the River Thames, and more body parts were found in the Thames next week. The Times reported on June 11th that the remains were found as far as follows. Tuesday, a left leg was found off of Battersea, lower left abdomen at Horsley Down on Tuesday. The liver was found at 9 Elms, and the upper body was found at Battersea Park, and the neck was found at Battersea. And Friday, a foot was found off of Wadsworth. And the reason why I'm hesitating is just because, oh my goodness, as somebody who regularly follows true crime cases, I don't always cringe and get absolutely grossed out. But yes, this person seems even more vicious than Jack the Ripper, the way that he's cutting apart these women very, very, very destructively. And this is also something that I think is another very important psychological distinction between the Thames Torso Killer and Jack the Ripper. You just heard this stuff, cutting off the leg, cutting off the foot, and one of the points that I didn't even read here, cutting off the buttocks and the pelvis. Absolutely sickening. But here is something that we have to remember. Why has this been done? Why has this been done? Has this been done because of sexual rage? I don't think so. When I read this stuff about how the body parts have been cut off and dismembered, it seems like this person is doing it to conceal evidence and destroy evidence and to hide the remains of the victims. Whereas the crimes that were committed by Jack the Ripper, the Canonical Five, as well as the murder of Martha Tavern, which occurred in August of 1888, seem to have been a completely different operation. That person was not trying to hide the remains of the victims. That person left all of the victims absolutely where they were. They did not transport the remains. They did not cut off the limbs. They took out the organs, which was most likely some type of, in my own unprofessional opinion, some type of trophy keeping or some type of sexual arousal was associated with taking the organs, the heart, the kidney, and the uterus. But that person might not have even been aware of what they were doing. They might not have even been aware of the exact organs that they were holding. Whereas if somebody's cutting off an arm or a leg, they are probably most likely aware that they're cutting off an arm or a leg. So again, I think that this is just a very, very different type of serial killer. And I don't want to be overly dismissive of these people who are proposing these Jack the Ripper suspects and being like, oh yeah, well it was Severin Glasowski. Oh yeah, well it was Charles Lechmere. But I just think this is absolutely a different serial killer, and that's just my take on the subject. And if you want to challenge me, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. I would love to read them. One of the reasons why we do this Ripper Wednesday segment is because it is an open discussion where you guys can give your feedback and you can respond, and you can tell me what you think in the comment section down below. And if you enjoy hearing about Jack the Ripper, in addition to liking and subscribing, you can also join the channel membership, and there will be a new segment that's coming out called Jack the Ripper, the Double Event, which will happen on Wednesday, starting in March of this year. And if you're listening to this in the future, you can join the membership and listen to Jack the Ripper, the Double Event. But I really want the Double Event to focus on the stories associated with the Jack the Ripper case, as opposed to just discussing the facts and the murders, because that stuff, I think, should not be part of any type of membership. That should just be made available on a YouTube channel. But let's keep going with the story of the Thames Torso murders, because we have perhaps one of the most famous cases, the most famous murder associated with the Thames Torso Killer, and that is the Pinchin Street torso murder. On September 10th of 1889, Police Constable William Pennant found the headless and legless torso of an unidentified woman under a railway arch at Pinchin Street in Whitechapel. It seems probable that the murder was committed elsewhere and that the parts of the dismembered body were dispersed for disposal. What did I just say? The reason why somebody would dismember a body, the reason why a serial killer would dismember a body is to transport the body and conceal evidence, to destroy evidence. There is some type of practical reason that is associated with this beyond sexual arousal. And I just think that this is a very different type of killer. A woman's torso was found at 5:15 a.m. on Tuesday, September 10th of 1889, under a railway arch in Pinchin Street. Extensive bruising about the woman's back and hip and arm indicated that she had been severely beaten shortly before her death, which had occurred approximately 1 day prior to the discovery of her torso. The victim's abdomen was also extensively mutilated in a manner reminiscent of the Ripper. And, okay, if there are mutilations, I do understand why people suspect that these are the same killer. Yes, the victims are female. I admit that. Yes, the victims have been mutilated. I admit that. Yes, the victims were women in vulnerable places. I admit that. But, well, I mean, those are just concessions that I will have to make. The woman's abdomen was also extensively mutilated, and the dismembered sections of the body are believed to have been transported to the railway arch and hidden under an old chemise. The age of the victim was also estimated to be 30 to 40 years old. Now, this is also something that's relatively consistent with Jack the Ripper's activities, because Jack the Ripper mostly targeted women who were a little bit older, with the exception of the murder of Mary Kelly. Mary Kelly was in her 20s, but Jack the Ripper's victims were in their late 30s to early 40s in his eyes. I mean, he would have perceived them as slightly older women. And, I mean, I'm not even completely convinced that Jack the Ripper cared too much about the age of the victims. I think that he was more or less targeting women and specifically looking for women who were in vulnerable places. But that's just my take on the subject. Despite a search of the area, no other sections of her body were ever found, and neither the victim nor the culprit were ever identified. And once again, with the murder of Elizabeth Jackson, she was actually identified because of a scar on her wrist by a family member, and also that there's another line here about how the killer must have had knowledge of the joints of the human body, and Elizabeth Jackson was 8 months pregnant. So, I mean, that's very, very saddening, but all the same. But I just think that there are certain differences that we have to notice. And we also have to recognize that if these two killers are operating at relatively the same time, 1887 to 1889, I mean, then that's not completely improbable based on the population of Whitechapel. If you're dealing with 70,000 residents, or if you're dealing with the entire population of England, are there going to be multiple serial killers who are operating? Yes, absolutely. I don't think that that is outrageous. I don't even think that that is a bizarre number to throw around. I mean, whether it's Whitechapel or London or England, I think that there could very easily have been two serial killers which have been operating. So I think that this is just a case of Jack the Ripper was a persona that was created by the media, and everybody's paying attention to the way this murderer is stalking the streets of Whitechapel and disemboweling women. Whereas the Thames Torso Killer is somebody who is more or less hiding in the shadows, and no persona was created by the media, therefore less attention has been paid to this case. But I want to know what you guys think. Put your ideas in the comment section down below. But you heard the introduction that was written out by R. Michael Gordon, and that states that there may be a link to a murder in Paris in 1886, and I am going to have to explore that in the future. I can't even comment on that one, but I can comment on this one, the murder that took place in London in 1902. In June of 1902, a woman's torso was found in Salamanca Alley in Lambeth in London. No suspect was ever identified in the case. And this is one of the reasons why I had a very difficult time with discussing the Thames Torso Killer in the past, because I was looking at these sets of crimes. You have 1887 to 1889, then you have a gap all the way to 1902. And I was just thinking, that's an enormous gap for a serial killer. Normally, a serial killer doesn't stay dormant for, let's see, how many years would that be? I am really bad with math, but we're dealing with over a decade. Over a decade from 1889 to 1902, for more than 10 years. Let's just say that. And I think that there could be a couple of explanations for this. Number one, somebody goes to jail for something else. Number two, somebody is out of the country and they're committing murders for a different reason elsewhere. And number three, that somebody is just trying to conceal their methods in a different way, and then they just want to have some type of revitalization. Or number four, there are stressors in the serial killer's life. Something has triggered this person to commit the murders again. That could also be taking place. But with the Thames Torso Killer, firstly, it sounds like the 1902 murder is unconfirmed, and I mean, it's hard to think about Jack the Ripper operating in the 20th century. Everybody thinks about Jack the Ripper in the 19th century. But I mean, like, if we're going to have some type of Jack the Ripper, Thames Torso parallels, we also have to admit that not all the crimes that have been connected to the Thames Torso Killer were actually the Thames Torso Killer. And I think that this concept of a dismembering serial killer is not completely impossible. It is not completely impossible. We saw something very similar with the Long Island serial killer, about how there was a prime suspect named John Bitroff who cut up the bodies of his victims. He was a convicted murderer, and then it turns out that it's a different individual named Rex Heuermann who's actually committing the Long Island serial killer murders. So that shows me that there can be multiple types of serial killers who want to cut up women's bodies at the same time operating. Probability doesn't rule that out. And also, it's the practicality, it's the MO, it's the reason why they're doing this, to transport the victims and to conceal evidence. But that's just my take on the subject, and I would love to know what you guys think, and please put your ideas in the comment section down below. As of now, I'm seeing two different killers, and I'm also seeing that I'm not even convinced this 1902 murder is actually the Thames Torso Killer, because, firstly, if someone knew about this, that could be a copycat, and secondarily, this could be somebody who is also doing this for a different reason. Very, very strange gap. No suspects have been identified, so we don't really know that much about the Thames Torso Killer. But in my own response, I think that this is not related to Jack the Ripper. I think that Jack the Ripper functioned in a very different way. He was the type of person who was not afraid of leaving the victims' bodies behind, and the Thames Torso Killer was. And this relates very specifically to high trait neuroticism or average neuroticism, whereas Jack the Ripper would have been very low in neuroticism, where he's not worried about leaving the victims behind and he just wants to escape. Maybe the Thames Torso Killer is even doing something different about luring them to a specific location where he can dismember the bodies as opposed to disemboweling them. But that is just my take on the subject. I would love to know what you think. Put your ideas in the comment section down below. And thank you so much for listening to this episode. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. And there is always BlackboxNed88 on TikTok and Instagram. And you guys know about the channel membership. You can join if you want to hear a bonus episode about Jack the Ripper every week. And that's all for me now. I will see you guys on Friday talking about D.B. Cooper, but I will also see you on Thursday talking about Zodiac Letters, Edward Wayne Edwards. Until next time.